The air on the Beaumont plantation didn't move. It was a thick, wet blanket smelling of damp soil, sweet-smelling jasmine, and the ever-present odor of human sweat and fear. The August sun had long set, but the heat remained trapped beneath the canopy of live oaks, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed like gray, skeletal fingers in the non-existent breeze. On the veranda of the main house, Elias Beaumont swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the clinking of ice the only sharp sound in the humid Georgia night. He was a man whose softness of body belied the sharp, flinty nature of his soul. His plantation was failing, the cotton prices were a pittance, and his debts in Savannah were mounting like a fever. His overseer, a gaunt, sun-beaten man named Davies, stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. He stared at a point just past Beaumont's shoulder, a habit he'd developed to avoid meeting the man's cold, assessing eyes. The trader from Charleston, he was persuasive, Beaumont said, his voice a low drawl that did nothing to hide its venom. Offers a fair price, 42 head, strong backs, fertile women. It will clear the ledgers and leave enough to see us through the winter. Davies shifted his weight. 42, sir, that's near a third of our people. That's families. You mean to break up families? Beaumont took a slow sip of his whiskey. I mean to survive, Mr. Davies. They are property, assets to be liquidated. You'll have the list for me by morning. Start with the field hands from the North Quarter. And Samuel's boy, Thomas, he's strong. He'll fetch a good price alone. He waved a dismissive hand. See to it. I don't want a whisper of this getting out before the transport wagons arrive on Thursday. But secrets on a plantation were like water in a sieve. A house slave had heard the hushed conversation. A furtive glance, a solemn nod, a whispered word passed in the twilight as buckets were carried from the well and the poison spread. It reached the slave quarters not as a rumor, but as a death sentence delivered on the humid night air. In a cabin at the edge of the quarters, furthest from the main house, Sarah held her 5-year-old daughter, Lee, rocking her gently even though the child was fast asleep. Her husband, James, sat on a small stool, his powerful hands, calloused and scarred from the cotton fields, resting uselessly on his knees. He was staring at the packed dirt floor as if he could see their future buried within it. They're taking Thomas, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. I heard Martha telling Lisa, Mr. Beaumont wants a list, 42 names. James's head snapped up, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of rage and helplessness. 42, that ain't just clearing a debt, that's gutting us. The door creaked open, and an older man stooped to enter. It was Samuel. His hair was a crown of white, and his face was a roadmap of sorrows, but his eyes held a deep, steady light. He was the community's anchor, their unofficial preacher, the keeper of their stories and their pain. Behind him, a few other men and women slipped inside, their faces grim masks in the flickering lamplight. He means to sell us down the river, a man named Joseph said, his voice thick with despair. We all know what that means. The sugar fields in Louisiana. A man don't last 5 years there. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of sold children, vanished wives, and brothers never seen again. They had all lived with this fear, a low hum beneath the surface of their lives. Now it was a roar. It was Sarah who broke it. Her voice was low but clear, stripped of all tears, hardened into something sharp. We run. The word hung in the air, a blasphemy and a prayer. To run was to be hunted by dogs, to be whipped to within an inch of your life, to be made an example of. No one had ever successfully escaped the Beaumont plantation. The swamp that bordered the western edge was a deterrent more effective than any fence, a maze of cypress knees, stagnant water, and things that slithered in the mud. Samuel looked at her, then at the other faces in the room. He saw the wild terror in their eyes, but beneath it, a tiny, dangerous ember of resolve. The swamp will kill us if the patrol riders don't, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Staying will kill us for certain, James countered, his voice rising. Not our bodies maybe, but our souls. I will not let them take my wife. I will not let them sell my child. Samuel looked from James's fire to Sarah's steel. He saw the same sentiment reflected in every pair of eyes that met his. They were no longer asking for wisdom or comfort. They were on a precipice. The choice was between a certain, slow dismemberment of their families and a desperate, terrifying leap into the unknown. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the weariness was gone, replaced by a profound, solemn gravity. "Then we don't run," he said, his voice barely audible. "We vanish, all of us on that list. And anyone else who will not be left behind." He looked at each person, sealing a pact with his gaze. "Tonight, before the sun rises, we go into the swamp together, or we die together, but we will not be sold." The dawn of August 12, 1841, broke not with the familiar chorus of roosters and the shuffling of feet towards the fields, but with a profound and unsettling silence. The air over the Beaumont plantation was heavy, thick with the cloying humidity of a Georgia summer, yet it was the absence of sound that was most suffocating. It was a silence that felt wrong, a hollow space where the rhythm of life should have been. Mr. Davies, the overseer, felt it first. A man whose days were measured by the crack of his whip and the weary groans of forced labor, he found the quiet unnerving. He stalked from his small cottage towards the slave quarters, his boots crunching on the dusty path. He expected to see figures emerging, readying for another day of backbreaking work in the cotton fields. Instead, he saw rows of silent, weathered cabins, too silent. "Samuel, you old goat, get them moving," he bellowed, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No reply. He strode to the first cabin, the one belonging to Samuel. He kicked the warped wooden door. It swung inward with a mournful creak, revealing an empty room. The straw bedding was rumpled. A small wooden cup lay on its side, but there was no sign of the old man. Davy's brow furrowed. He moved to the next cabin, Sarah's, empty. The small children's pallets were bare. A knot of cold dread began to tighten in his stomach. He moved faster from door to door, shoving them open one by one. Empty, empty, all empty, 42 souls. Gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He ran, stumbling in his haste, towards the grand plantation house, its white columns looking down on him with cold indifference. He burst onto the veranda without knocking, a breach of protocol that spoke volumes of his terror. Elias Beaumont was at his breakfast table, meticulously slicing a piece of ham. He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance at the interruption. "What is the meaning of this, Davies?" Elias snapped, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. "Sir, they're gone," Davies stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing paths through the grime on his temples. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Gone?" Elias asked, his voice deceptively calm. "One of them run off. We'll make an example of him." "No, sir, not one," Davies said, his voice trembling. "All of them, the 42. For the sale, they're all gone. The cabins are empty." For a moment, Elias Beaumont just stared. The silver fork in his hand clattered onto the fine china plate. Disbelief warred with a sudden volcanic fury. This wasn't a runaway. This was an insurrection, a theft. "All of them," he whispered, the words filled with venom. Then his voice erupted, a roar of pure rage that shook the windows. "All of them, my property, stolen from right under my nose." He slammed his fist on the table, sending silverware scattering. "Get the men, every man you can find. They can't have gone far. They are on foot, for God's sake. Search the roads, the river path. I want them found, Davies. I want them found, and I want them to pay." The search began with a furious, chaotic energy. Beaumont, on his finest horse, rode like a man possessed, his face purple with rage. Davies and a handful of other white workers fanned out, their initial confidence quickly eroding under the oppressive sun. They checked the dusty main road leading to Macon, finding nothing but the tracks of a passing carriage from the day before. They scoured the paths leading to neighboring plantations, their calls echoing unanswered through the pines. They questioned the remaining enslaved people, who stood in clusters, their faces carefully blank, their eyes downcast. Their answers were monosyllabic, a chorus of "don't know, sir," and "ain't seen nothing, sir." Fear was a thick blanket over them, but whether it was fear of Beaumont or fear of betraying their kin, Davies couldn't tell. Hours bled into one another. The morning's fury simmered into a frustrating, grinding search. The most baffling part was the lack of any evidence. There were no broken fences, no discarded bundles, no signs of a struggle. 42 people, including the elderly and small children, had simply evaporated into the humid air. It was impossible. It was a young farmhand named Jeb, a quiet boy known for his tracking skills, who finally broke the stalemate. "Mr. Beaumont, sir," he said, his voice hesitant. "We ain't checked the swamp." Elias spat on the ground. They wouldn't be foolish enough to go in there. That's a death sentence. But they had exhausted every other possibility. With a frustrated wave of his hand, he gestured for them to follow. They made their way to the western edge of the property, where the neatly plowed fields gave way to a menacing line of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The air grew cooler, smelling of mud and decay. And there, in the soft, dark earth at the swamp's border, they found them. Tracks, dozens of them. The small prints of children next to the large, bare footprints of men and the worn impressions of women's shoes. A jumbled, chaotic testament to a mass exodus. The trail was undeniable, leading directly towards the forbidding black water. They followed the tracks right to the edge. And then, abruptly, inexplicably, they stopped. It was as if a line had been drawn in the mud. On one side, the clear evidence of 42 people. On the other, nothing. The still, tea-colored water of the Okefenokee swamp lay before them, unblemished. No snapped reeds, no muddy swirls, no sign that anyone had entered. The tracks simply ceased to exist, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The men stood in stunned silence, the buzzing of insects the only sound. The impossible had just become incomprehensible. Elias Beaumont stared at the spot where the footprints ended, a line drawn in the mud by an invisible hand. The oppressive August humidity seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, mirroring the suffocating rage building in his chest. "Impossible," he snarled, the word a ragged tear in the humid air. He turned on his overseer, his face a mask of purple fury. "Men do not simply dissolve, Davies. Are you telling me 42 souls grew wings and flew from this very spot?" Davies, sweating profusely under the Georgian sun, flinched but held his ground. "Elias, look for yourself. The tracks lead here and only here. There's no sign of a boat, no broken branches, not a single scrap of cloth caught on the brambles. It's unnatural." The other men in the search party murmured in agreement, their eyes darting nervously toward the dark, menacing curtain of cypress and Spanish moss that marked the Okefenokee's edge. They were local men, farmers and laborers who knew the swamp not as a landmark, but as a predator. They spoke in hushed tones of its black water that could swallow a horse, of cottonmouths thick as a man's arm, and of the gators that lay silent as logs waiting. To them, this wasn't just a failed search. It was a brush with a place that didn't follow the rules of God or man. Refusing to be defeated by what he saw as superstition and incompetence, Beaumont rode back to the plantation in a storm of cold resolve. His financial ruin was no longer a threat. It was a certainty if he couldn't recover his property. That afternoon, he dispatched a rider to Savannah with a handsome sum and a simple instruction: hire Silas Kane. Kane, known throughout the state as the Hound, was a slave catcher of terrifying renown. He was a gaunt, wiry man with eyes so pale they seemed to absorb the light, leaving nothing behind. He arrived 2 days later with a pair of lean, scarred dogs that whined with a constant predatory hunger. He listened to Beaumont's frantic explanation with unnerving stillness, his only reaction a slight, humorless twitch of his lips. He spent little time at the empty cabins, his focus absolute. He led his dogs to the swamp's edge, to the line of finality. He knelt, running a finger along the rim of a child's footprint. His dogs sniffed the air, paced the water line, and then fell silent, sitting back on their haunches with a confusion that unsettled even their master. They met the water here, Cain stated, his voice flat and raspy. All of them walked right in, then find where they came out, Beaumont demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. Cain shook his head slowly. That's the thing, Mr. Beaumont. There is no out. The scent is gone, not faded, not washed away. Gone. It's like the water itself is a wall, never seen the like. While Cain and his men spent the next 2 days fruitlessly circling the perimeter, Beaumont turned his frustration on those who remained. He had Davies pull Hattie from the kitchens, an elderly woman whose own son was among the missing. She stood before him on the grand porch of the main house, her back straight, her face a carefully composed mask of deference. Hattie, you knew, Beaumont accused, leaning in close. You knew Samuel's plan. Where did they go? She met his gaze without blinking, her hands clasped in front of her. Mr. Beaumont, sir, I only know what the good Lord provides. They was here one day, and the Lord saw fit to move on the next. It ain't for me to question his work. Her voice was soft, respectful, yet held a core of unbendable steel. Every pious, ambiguous answer she gave was a small victory, a shield against his rage. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes but could prove nothing. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, more enraged by his powerlessness than ever. On the third day, Silas Cain returned, his clothes caked in mud, his face grim. Waste of time and money, Mr. Beaumont, he declared, accepting a pouch of coins without thanks. Either they all drowned within 100 feet of that bank, every last one of them, without a single body floating up, or they figured out a way to walk on water. I track men, not ghosts. Cain and his dogs were gone by midday. Beaumont was left alone, standing on his porch, staring toward the distant dark line of the swamp. The professional had failed. His own men feared the place. His remaining slaves met his questions with a wall of silent, prayerful resistance. The mystery was no longer just a financial problem. It was a personal affront, an impossible riddle that was beginning to fester in his soul. The 42 had not just escaped. They had erased themselves from his world, leaving behind only a chilling silence and the burgeoning whispers of a legend. The air in the Okefenokee was a living thing, thick and wet, tasting of decay and damp earth. For the 42 souls huddled at its edge, it was the breath of either salvation or a watery grave. The moon, a fractured sliver behind the dense cypress canopy, offered little comfort, casting the black water and tangled roots into monstrous shapes. Every rustle of leaves, every deep-throated croak of a bullfrog sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. Samuel held up a hand, his silhouette a bulwark against the suffocating darkness. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scanned the faces around him, eyes wide with fear, reflecting the murky water at their feet. He saw Sarah clutching her son, Joshua, so tightly the boy could barely breathe. He saw the trembling hands of the elders and the defiant, terrified stares of the young men. One mistake, one cry, one panicked splash would bring Beaumont's hounds and guns crashing down upon them. The water is our only road now, Samuel whispered, his voice a low rumble barely louder than the hum of insects. And it must swallow our path whole. There was no grand trick, no elaborate device. The plan was brutal in its simplicity, born of Samuel's careful observation over years of forced labor near the swamp's perimeter. It relied on discipline, on a collective will stronger than individual fear. He pointed a long, steady finger not forward but sideways parallel to the bank. We enter here, one by one, no sound. You will feel the mud try to take your legs. Let it. Do not fight it, just pull free slow. We move along the edge in the water until we reach the fallen cypress 200 paces north. The roots make a wall. We get out there. The dogs will find where we went in, but they will find no place where we came out. It was a terrifying prospect. The water, black and cold, was rumored to hide snakes and things with teeth. To stay in it for so long, moving through the grasping cypress knees and sucking muck, felt like a sentence of its own. A young man named Thomas shook his head, his teeth chattering. 200 paces, in this, will be lost, or taken by gators. Silence, Samuel commanded, his voice sharp but low. Fear is a master, same as Beaumont. You serve one, you can't run from the other. We go now. He stepped into the water first. The cold seized his calves, and the mud sucked greedily at his ankles. He suppressed a gasp, his face a mask of stone. He turned and extended a hand to Sarah. She took it, her own hand trembling, and lifted Joshua higher onto her hip. She whispered into the boy's ear, a constant, soothing murmur as she followed Samuel into the oppressive chill. One by one, they slipped into the water, a silent chain of shadows dissolving into the swamp. The last man, as instructed, carefully smoothed the mud on the bank, erasing the final signs of their entry point. Each step was a battle. Roots snagged their clothes, threatening to pull them under. Unseen things brushed against their skin. A woman stifled a sob as her foot sank deep, and the man behind her caught her arm, holding her steady without a word. Sarah focused only on Joshua's warmth against her side and the reassuring bulk of Samuel's back in front of her. She repeated a silent prayer, a rhythm that matched her cautious footsteps. Keep him quiet, Lord, keep him safe. The 200 paces felt like an eternity. The sounds of the night, the chirps, the clicks, the splashes of unseen creatures were magnified, each one a potential harbinger of discovery. But there was another sound too. The steady, controlled breathing of 42 people bound by a single purpose. It was the sound of defiance. Finally, Samuel stopped. Ahead, a massive, ancient cypress tree lay on its side, its huge root ball ripped from the earth to form a tangled wall of wood and mud. It created a deep hidden alcove shielded from the open bank. Here, he breathed out quietly. Heaving themselves over the gnarled roots, they collapsed onto a small patch of semi-solid ground, shivering and covered in black, foul-smelling mud. They were a mass of exhausted, trembling bodies, but they were hidden. They were through the first door. Samuel stood watch, listening intently to the sounds carrying across the water. For now, there was nothing but the swamp's own heartbeat. He looked at his people, huddled together in the dark. Their fear was still palpable, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile ember of hope had been lit. They had done the impossible. They had vanished. Dawn in the Okefenokee was not a gentle affair. It didn't break, it seeped. A pale gray light filtered through the dense canopy of cypress and tupelo, turning the black water into a murky, liquid mirror. Mist clung to the surface, swirling in ghostly tendrils around the knees of ancient trees draped in Spanish moss. For the 42 souls huddled on the small hummock of land, the new day brought not relief, but a chilling, damp clarity to their predicament. The adrenaline of the escape had curdled into the cold dread of survival. Stiffness had settled deep into their bones. The ground was unforgiving, and the humid air offered no warmth. Children whimpered quietly, their cries muffled against their mothers' chests. Sarah held Joshua close, feeling the slight tremor in his small body. He wasn't crying, but his wide eyes stared into the oppressive green maze surrounding them, reflecting a fear he was too young to understand but too old not to feel. The meager rations they had managed to grab, a few handfuls of cornbread, some scraps of dried pork, were either gone or hopelessly sodden. Then, a sound cut through the drone of insects and the soft lapping of water. It was faint, carried on the morning breeze, but unmistakable. The baying of a hound. A wave of pure terror washed over the group. Bodies went rigid. A young woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Everyone flattened themselves against the damp earth, trying to melt into the landscape. Samuel, his face a mask of weathered stone, held up a single, steady hand. His eyes scanned the faces around him, demanding a silence that was more than the absence of noise. It was the absence of movement, of breath, of hope itself. They lay there for what felt like an eternity, their hearts hammering against their ribs until the distant sound faded back into the swamp's chorus. But the silence it left behind was different. It was now filled with the echo of the hunt. "We can't stay here," a man named Isaac rasped, his voice raw with fear and frustration. He was a powerfully built man, a blacksmith from the plantation, and his wife, Martha, was shivering beside him, her face flushed with fever. "They're on us. We need to move deeper." Now, Samuel slowly pushed himself to a sitting position, his movements deliberate. "And go where, Isaac?" he asked, his voice a low whisper that still carried authority. "Deeper into what? A gator's den? A water moccasin's nest? To move without purpose is to die faster. To stay is to wait for the rope." Isaac shot back, his whisper sharpening into a snarl. He gestured at his wife. "Martha is sick. The children are hungry. My hands can build, they can fight. They can't do anything sitting on this mud pile, waiting for Cain's dogs to find us." A few others murmured in agreement, their fear making them desperate for action, any action. "The dogs lost our trail at the water's edge," Samuel countered, his gaze unwavering. "That was the plan. They are searching blind. Every step we take now leaves a new trail. A broken branch, a footprint in the mud, noise. A fire for warmth will bring them down on us before the smoke clears. We will be patient. We will be quiet. We will become ghosts just as we planned. We'll become corpses," Isaac spat, his frustration boiling over. He stood up, towering over the seated elder. "We need food, real food. I can set a snare. A turtle, a raccoon. The sound of a struggling animal will carry just as far as a man's voice," Samuel insisted, his calm a stark contrast to Isaac's agitation. It was Sarah who broke the standoff. She hadn't moved from her spot, her arms still wrapped protectively around Joshua. "What is the first step, Samuel?" Her voice was quiet, devoid of accusation or panic, but it sliced through the tension. It was a practical question, a mother's question. It wasn't about who was right, it was about what came next. "The children need water that won't sicken them. What is the first thing we must do to survive this day?" The question seemed to ground both men. Isaac's shoulders slumped slightly, the fire in his eyes banking. Samuel gave Sarah a brief, grateful nod. He pointed a long, bony finger toward a dense patch of low-growing fan palms. "There," he said, "saw palmetto. You cut out the heart. It is bitter, but it is food. It will quiet the stomach." He then gestured to the water's edge. "The cattails. The roots can be eaten. It's not much, but it is life." He showed two of the younger men how to find the cupped leaves of pitcher plants where rainwater, filtered and clean, had collected. It was a slow, painstaking process. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the soft squelch of mud and the rustle of vegetation. They gathered a small pile of fibrous roots and bitter palmetto hearts. It was a pathetic-looking hoard, but it was theirs. It was the first thing they had ever truly owned. As the afternoon wore on, they ate their meager meal. Sarah chewed her portion slowly before giving a softened piece to Joshua. She saw Isaac helping Martha drink the precious collected water, his earlier anger replaced by a grim, focused tenderness. The unity of the group had been tested and had held, but the cracks were visible. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple that barely penetrated their green prison, the distant baying of the dogs returned, a cruel, daily promise that their ordeal was far from over. The air in late summer Georgia was a thick, wet blanket, clinging to the skin and promising no relief until long after the sun had bled out behind the pines. On the Beaumont plantation, the day began as it always did, with the clang of a distant bell and the groan of bodies rising from thin pallets stuffed with corn husks. This was the rhythm of their world, a cadence of sunup to sundown labor dictated by cotton and tobacco, measured in aching backs and calloused hands. Samuel, his hair more salt than pepper, moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had seen 60 such summers. His authority didn't come from a booming voice, but from the quiet wisdom in his eyes and the way he tended the small, grudgingly permitted herb garden behind his cabin. He was a mender of tools, of minor ailments, of fractured spirits. This morning, he was crushing yarrow leaves between his fingers. The sharp, medicinal, sent a small act of defiance against the morning's oppressive humidity. He watched the others file out towards the fields, his gaze lingering on the younger ones, a familiar ache tightening his chest. Further down the row of cabins, Sarah tried to coax a smile from her son, Joshua. He was small for his 7 years, with wide, watchful eyes that missed nothing. She hummed a low tune, a song her own mother had hummed, while braiding a small piece of twine. It was a simple game, a way to carve out a moment of peace before the day swallowed them both. "See," she whispered, looping the twine into a cat's cradle. "Even a simple string can make a world, little one." Her love for him was a fierce, protective fire, the one thing the plantation's suffocating routine could not extinguish. The first crack in this fragile normalcy came not as a roar, but as a whisper. A traveling merchant, his wagon loaded with goods for the main house, had been careless with his tongue. Words like creditors and overdue notes drifted from the veranda, caught by the sharp ears of the house staff. The news spread through the quarters not in sentences, but in glances, in a subtle tensing of shoulders, in the way a tool was gripped a little tighter. They had all seen this before on other plantations. Financial trouble for the master meant disaster for the enslaved. That evening, as twilight settled, the overseer, Mr. Gable, became a specter of their anxiety. He was a man whose cruelty was usually casual, born of laziness and power. But now, there was a new tension in him. He stalked the rows, his whip tapping against his boot, his temper shorter than a winter day. He berated a young man for a slightly crooked row of tobacco with a fury that was disproportionate and terrifying. Everyone knew what it meant. Pressure was coming from the main house. In the dim light, Isaac, a strong man whose hands could fix any wagon wheel, held his wife Martha's hand. She coughed, a dry, persistent hack that worried him more each day. "Don't you mind, Gable," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "He's just a dog kicking dirt 'cause his own master kicked him." But his attempt at reassurance felt hollow. They both knew the truth. They were not dirt, they were assets. And assets could be liquidated. A few days later, the fear took on a cold, official shape. Elias Beaumont, usually a remote figure seen only from a distance, was seen walking the edge of the fields with a stranger in a city suit. They weren't looking at the crops, they were looking at the people working them. They pointed, they conferred, they made notes in a small leather-bound book. That night, the air in the quarters was thick with an unspoken dread. Families drew closer, children were held tighter. The usual quiet murmurings and occasional laughter were gone, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. The future, once a distant, hazy thing, had suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. It had a price, and they all feared they would be the ones to pay it. As the last light faded, leaving only the faint glow of embers and the flicker of fireflies, Sarah saw Samuel sitting on his stool, staring out towards the dark mass of the swamp that bordered the property. She approached quietly, Joshua asleep in their cabin behind her. She didn't need to speak. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the gloom. The shared understanding was absolute. "The air feels heavy, Samuel," she said, her voice barely audible. "Feels like a storm's coming." He nodded slowly, his gaze turning back to the impenetrable blackness of the Okefenokee. "It is," he replied, his voice graveled with age and sorrow. "And it will not be a storm of rain and wind." He paused, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. "We must be the strong root that holds when the ground gives way. We must be ready." 3 months had passed, since the night the earth seemed to swallow 42 souls. What was once a desperate huddle of fugitives had slowly, painstakingly, transformed into a fledgling community. Deep within the Okefenokee's labyrinthine waterways, they had found a defensible island, a hidden rise of land shielded by ancient cypress trees and thickets of saw palmetto. Huts crafted from mud, Spanish moss, and woven branches formed a rough circle around a perpetual fire pit that was the heart of their new world. The constant, oppressive fear had not vanished, but it had receded, replaced by the demanding rhythm of survival. Sarah watched her son, Marcus, now 9 years old, sitting beside Samuel. The old man was patiently teaching the boy how to properly fletch an arrow with hawk feathers. There was a focus in Marcus's eyes she had never seen before, not the fearful alertness of the enslaved, but the quiet concentration of a learner. He was no longer property in training. He was a boy learning the skills of his people. The sight brought a familiar ache to Sarah's chest, a mix of profound relief and unspeakable grief for all they had endured to reach this moment. The rustle of branches at the edge of the clearing brought everyone to a sudden, tense silence. Spears were subtly lifted, and mothers pulled children closer. It was Jacob and 2 other men, the designated scouts, returning from their most dangerous mission yet, a week-long journey to the swamp's perimeter to glean any news from the world they had left behind. Jacob's face was grim, etched with exhaustion, but as he stepped into the firelight, he held up a hand to quell their fears. He waited until every eye was on him. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy. "The search is done." A collective, shuddering breath passed through the community. "We listened in on a group of trappers near the Swanee," Jacob continued, his words gaining strength. "The talk from the towns is that Beaumont is ruined. His creditors took everything. He sold the main house and left the state. They never found a single body, not a shred of cloth. The official story, the one they tell themselves to sleep at night, is that the swamp took us all. They say we were swallowed whole by gators and quicksand the very first night. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't laced with fear, but with a heavy, momentous understanding. They were ghosts. To the world that had owned them, they were dead. The chains had not just been broken, they had been erased." Sarah looked at Marcus, and for the first time, a tear she had held back for months traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of finality. That evening, Samuel gathered everyone around the central fire. The flames danced across the 42 faces, illuminating expressions of relief, sorrow, and a dawning, terrifying hope. Samuel's voice, though weathered, carried with the weight of a prophet. "They say the swamp took us," he began, his gaze sweeping over each person. "They are wrong. The swamp did not take us. It received us. The water did not drown us. It cleansed us of our tracks. This place was not our grave. It is our cradle." He gestured to the dark, teeming wilderness around them. "We were born again in this wilderness, baptized in its waters. We have faced hunger, sickness, and fear. We have buried 2 of our own, taken not by the master's whip, but by the fever of this new life." He paused, letting them remember the 2 graves marked by simple wooden totems at the island's edge. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. It is part of the price. Freedom is never free. He looked at the children, whose wide eyes reflected the fire. "There is no Beaumont here. There is no overseer. There are no auction blocks. There is only us. We must decide what that means. We are not runaways anymore. We are founders." The next day, a new energy filled the settlement. The talk was no longer of listening for hounds or rationing meager supplies, but of the future. They decided their home needed a name, not one given by a surveyor or a master, but one they earned. After much debate, they settled on Sanctuary. It was simple, true, and everything they had fought for. They established a council, with Samuel as their elder advisor, and designated tasks not by force, but by skill and willingness. They were building a society from scratch, founded on the one principle they had been denied their entire lives: self-determination. As twilight fell, casting long shadows from the cypress knees, Sarah sat with Marcus and her younger daughter Lee. She braided Lee's hair, while Marcus proudly showed her the arrow he had finished. It was crude, imperfect, but it was his. She looked from her children's faces to the faces of her community, gathered around the fire, their voices rising in a quiet song, a spiritual they had reshaped with new words of deliverance and resilience. The oppressive Georgia humidity now felt like a protective blanket. The hum of insects and the deep bellow of a distant alligator were no longer sounds of terror, but the lullaby of their fortress. They had not simply vanished. They had willed themselves into a new existence, a defiant, living testament hidden in the heart of the swamp where they were finally, impossibly free.